My earliest memories are marred by the subtle sting of comparison. Why can't you be more sociable like your sister? Mom shook her head as I sat in my corner with a book, immersed in a fictional world far from conversations and laughter, while Katie, the youngest by 2 years, cheerfully played out scenes in front of the guests, skillfully copying the expressions of adults and adding to them an exaggerated expression that delighted the audience. I was 8, she was 6, but the template was already set, like an unshakable formula for our lives. I was quiet, thoughtful, introverted, and Katie was bright, lively, and everyone's favorite. "Emily, honey, why don't you join the conversation?" "What is it?" my father asked softly, but with a noticeable note of disappointment in his voice, holding out his hand to me in a timid attempt to involve me, to give me a chance to prove that I, too, could be a part of this endlessly lively and noisy scene. But I just squeezed the book tighter, finding solace in its pages, in a world where no one demanded that I be someone else. Meanwhile, Katie, beaming, was sitting on his lap, her ringing laughter ringing in the air, and I saw his face light up with pride, with some special warmth that I thought was never meant for me. Before we continue, I am very curious. Which country are you from, dear listeners? Write in the comments where you are listening to us from. Enjoy listening. Favoritism was not just in small things. It manifested itself in everything, permeated every aspect of our lives, becoming something self-evident beyond doubt. When Katie wanted to study ballet at the age of 7, they bought her a brand new pink toque and the most expensive pointe shoes, as if confirming that her wishes were important, meaningful, and justified. A year later, when I cautiously talked about trying to play the flute, my mother sighed heavily, citing the budget, and a few weeks later handed me a used instrument she had bought on eBay. I remember one special Christmas when I was 12. Hoping, I wrote a list of gifts in which the laptop was in the first place. Not just a whim, but a necessity that would help me in my studies, in the endless essays, reports, and research projects that I was so passionate about. But in the morning, when I tore open the wrapping paper, I found only a few items of clothing and a stack of books, certainly useful, but not the ones I dreamed of. At the same time, Katie, who was only 10, was enthusiastically clutching a brand new iPhone to her chest because, according to her mother, she needs to stay in touch with everyone. I silently swallowed my resentment, realizing that my needs would always be secondary. The only person who seemed to see the real me was Grandma Marta, my father's mother. Every summer, when Katie's parents took her on family trips, to Disneyland, to California beaches, to European tours, I was left with her like unwanted baggage that did not fit into the family idol. "They're leaving me behind again," I complained one day, holding back tears as I watched them pack the car. Grandma hugged me, her old fingers gently stroked my hair, and she whispered, "Their loss, honey. You and I are going to have our own adventure." And she kept her word. These summer months, filled with the aroma of apple pie that we baked together and stories about her childhood, became my salvation. She taught me how to knit, cook, and listen to me with sincere attention, which I did not receive from my parents. It was only when I was with her that I felt important and valuable. But nothing hurts like accidentally hearing the truth. At the age of 15, after staying late to prepare for the upcoming competition, I left the room to pour myself a glass of water and froze when I heard the muffled voices of my parents from the kitchen. "We need to start thinking about college funds," my father was saying, sounding tired. "Well, we can only afford to send one of them," the mother replied with insulting ease. "Katie shows great promise in the theater circle. She could really succeed in the performing arts," she continued, as if it were an obvious choice. "What about Emily?" my father asked cautiously, but there was no confidence in his voice, no protection. "Emily is smart. She'll figure something out. Maybe she can get a scholarship." I stood there, the cold glass in my hand, the forgotten glass trembling in my fingers, and their words stuck in my head like nails. They didn't see investments in me, didn't believe that my future was worth their efforts. That night was a turning point. If they weren't going to invest in my future, I'd have to do it myself. From that day on, I threw myself into my studies with renewed vigor. I participated in science fairs, discussion clubs, and math competitions, grabbing at every academic opportunity like a drowning man grabbing a lifeline. While Katie went on dates with boys, having fun and enjoying the ease of life, I stayed up at night polishing my essays, preparing for debates, perfecting every detail of my college applications. "Emily, you're just jealous that your sister has a social life," Mom said, when I tried to point out that Katie was indulging in too much for a 14-year-old girl. I didn't argue. I would go to my room, close the door, and clutching medals, diplomas, and certificates in my hands, remind myself, one day all this work will pay off. One day I will build a life in which I will not have to compete for love or attention. I just had to survive high school first. All those long nights spent poring over textbooks, hours spent preparing for academic competitions, endless essays, projects, discussion clubs, math contests. It all finally paid off. I graduated from high school with top marks and received a full scholarship to a state university where I was to study business management. On the day when the long-awaited letter of enrollment arrived, I couldn't contain my excitement, rushed down the stairs, holding the envelope in my hands. My heart was pounding in my chest with pride and relief. But when I burst into the living room, I found my parents concentrating on helping Katie get ready for another date. She was enthusiastically spinning in front of it in the mirror, straightening her dress, while her mother chose the right earrings for her, and her father, grinning, gave advice on how to behave with guys. "Mom, Dad, I started, but Mom only glanced at me, waving me off with a smile. "Later, Emily, not now. Can't you see Katie is leaving?" And I realized that this moment, which meant so much to me, had no meaning for them. That evening, I didn't say a word. I just went up to my room, clutching the letter to my chest, feeling a familiar, but already familiar feeling of loneliness flare up inside. Moving to a dorm was my first real breath of fresh air, the first step towards a life where I no longer had to fight for attention, prove my worth, or try to meet someone's expectations. There, among people who hadn't known me since childhood and hadn't compared me to Katie, I finally felt like myself. My roommate Sarah quickly became the sister I always wanted to have. She rejoiced at my successes, supported me in difficult moments, and believed in me in a way my family had never believed in. Being separated from my parents didn't bother me. On the contrary, I felt freedom, which became more tangible every day. Phone calls home were rare, but even during these brief conversations, the script remained the same. "Katie is dating the captain of the soccer team now," Mom exclaimed. Not even asking how my classes were going, not interested in my life. "She's so popular, everyone just adores her." "Are you seeing anyone, Emily?" I muttered something about being focused on studying and quickly ended the call, not wanting to hear the world revolving around Katie again. The truth was, I was doing well. My professors noted my hard work. My friends appreciated me for who I am, not for who I should be. And for the first time, I felt significant not because of comparison, but because of my own achievements. But in the third year, something happened that rekindled the old pain in me. During one of the rare family calls, Mom casually dropped, "Oh, by the way, Katie was accepted to a prestigious university. We are so proud. We found her the most charming campus next to the faculty. You should see the view. Of course, we fully cover all expenses. We want her to focus on her studies without worrying about money." I sat in my cramped dorm room, holding the phone to my ear, holding back tears of anger and resentment. The same parents who told me they couldn't afford to pay for my tuition now didn't hesitate to pay for Katie to study at one of the most expensive universities in the country. But I didn't let myself sink into the pain. I channeled that anger into determination. I graduated from the university with honors and immediately got a job at Mitchell & Associates, one of the leading consulting firms in the city. I worked tirelessly, proving my worth in every detail, in every project, in every report that I prepared with the utmost precision. After 2 years of hard work, full of self-sacrifice and endless striving for excellence, I was promoted to senior consultant. That evening, colleagues insisted on celebrating at the Blue Room, a trendy bar in the city center. That's where I met James. He was charming, successful, and confident, but most importantly, he was really interested in me, my career, and my achievements. For the first time in my life, someone looked at me not through the prism of comparison, not as Katie's shadow, but as an independent person. We exchanged numbers, started dating, and after 2 years of dating, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I felt truly loved and valued. And then the wedding invitation from Katie came. She was married to Richard Thompson III, a famous real estate developer whom she met in college. I didn't want to go. Every nerve inside me was resisting the idea, but James convinced me. It'll look worse if you don't show up at all. The wedding was exactly what I expected it to be. Excessive, pretentious, filled with ostentatious luxury and deliberate display of status. Katie, dressed in a designer dress, literally soared above the crowd, radiating confidence and delight, as if she was not just getting married, but concluding the deal of the century. We bumped into each other at the Mirror in one of the side rooms during the reception, when, in her opinion, we were supposed to have a mandatory sisters moment. She gave me a look of undisguised victory and grinned. I always knew that I would be the first at the altar, she said, tilting her head slightly to one side, as if studying my face. I didn't answer, but she continued, putting her hand on my shoulder with a show of sympathy. I mean, you've always been so focused on your career and everything. But don't worry, maybe someday you'll find someone too. Her voice was sweet, almost friendly, but every word was imbued with the same poison that poisoned my childhood. I looked at her and realized that no matter how much I had achieved, for her and for our family, I would always remain in second place. I stood in the doorway of my old room, the one where I once dreamed of the future, where I taught all night long, where, with my nose in the pillow, I stifled resentment against my parents, who always had no time to notice my progress, and watched as my younger sister and the man I loved, they were lying in a rumpled bed, in an ugly tangle of arms and legs, among crumpled sheets, with glints of sweat on their skin, with heavy breathing that had not yet subsided. My Katie, my James. The room suddenly became cramped. The walls seemed to shift. The air became viscous, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. Emily, wait, I can explain. James was thrashing around, grabbing clothes, pulling on trousers with such a desperate look, as if he had fastened his belt faster, it could have changed reality, made me forget what I had just seen. But I couldn't forget. Katie didn't even try to cover herself. She just lay there, leaning against the pillow, propped up on her elbow, and smiled. The same condescending smile I'd known since childhood, the one she gave me when she told my mom about how classmates said I was weird. The one she used to look at me with during her graduation, sure that I would be just a boring shadow in the corner. The one she smiled at her wedding ceremony, when she convinced herself that she had beaten me on all fronts. You look like you're going to cry, she said lazily, pulling the blanket up to her chest. Oh, don't tell me you really thought he was going to marry you. James turned to her, his face contorted, either from anger or fear. Katie, damn it, are you... She batted her eyelashes innocently. Told the truth? I didn't recognize my voice when I finally managed to say, How long ago? James turned away, and Katie slowly smiled even wider, enjoying this moment, savoring it. Oh, baby, the truth is, it's something that's inevitable. Don't you understand? He always looked at me. She stretched like a cat enjoying its own triumph. You were just too busy with your career to notice. I suddenly felt something inside of me break. Normally, I would just leave. I would have held back my emotions, suppressed them, as I have done all my life. But not this time. I stepped forward, and before any of them could react, I grabbed the vase on the bedside table, the one my mom had given me for my 16th birthday, and threw it at the wall with all my might. The loud sound of broken glass pierced the silence. Katie shuddered. James took a step towards me. His hands shot up as if he was going to grab my shoulders, hold me back. Emily, let's talk. Get out. My voice was low, icy, filled with rage that had been simmering inside me for years. Wait, out. I could feel my hands shaking, my pulse pounding in my temples, and my heart pounding so violently that it seemed like it was about to burst. Katie shrugged and got out of bed, casually picking up her expensive underwear from the floor, as if this moment meant nothing to her. "You've always been so dramatic, Emily," she said with a smile, buttoning her dress. "I wouldn't be surprised if I feel sorry for you." I looked at her and saw emptiness. I didn't feel sorry for her. I wasn't mad at her. I didn't feel anything anymore. James stood there, still trying to say something, his face contorted in the painful realization that he had just ruined everything. But I didn't care. I turned around and left the room, leaving them there among the fragments, among the shattered illusions. When I went downstairs, the party was still going on. The guests were laughing, the parents were discussing something with distant relatives, the clink of glasses could be heard everywhere, and no one even noticed that something had happened. I went to the table, grabbed a bottle of champagne, filled the glass to the brim, and drained it in one gulp. "Emily, honey, are you okay?" Mom's voice came to me. I looked at her worried face, at my father who was sitting next to me and having an animated conversation with Aunt Margaret, at the people who were my so-called family, but who never knew who I really was. I put the glass back on the table, turned around, and left the house. The fresh night air burned my face, but I didn't feel the cold. I walked down the street, breathing it in, and with every second I felt something heavy fall off me, as if I had finally gotten rid of the chains that had held me down all my life. I was no longer Katie's sister. I wasn't James's girlfriend anymore. I was no longer someone who was compared, devalued, or overlooked. I was Emily, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. The next morning, I woke up to a silence that couldn't be called cozy or peaceful. It was the silence of devastation, the rumble of thunder after a devastating hurricane swept away everything in its path. Fragments of thoughts throbbed in my head, but none of them lingered for long, leaving behind only a vague feeling that I had made the only right decision for myself, even if it was harder for me than I could have imagined. I slowly sat up in bed and looked around the room, which had become somehow alien overnight. The shelves of books that I once chose with James, the empty hangers in the closet left after I put his things in boxes, the photo of the two of us still standing on the bedside table. I took it in my hands, looked at our smiling faces, at the joy that seemed so real at the time, and without regret, threw the picture into the trash. The phone left on the bedside table continued to vibrate. New messages flashed on the screen. But I no longer needed to read them to know that there were endless pleas from my mother to not take out the trash from the hut, James's attempts to explain everything, the reproachful words of my father, who always preferred to consider me too emotional. I got up, went into the kitchen, turned on the coffee maker, and while it mumbled and filled the air with the smell of freshly ground grains, I stared out the window. The city behind the glass was living its own life. People were rushing to business, rushing to work, arguing on the phone, smiling at someone on the other end of the line, and none of them even suspected that my life had been turned upside down in the last 24 hours. Feeling my fingers grow cold from the strain, I clenched my palms into fists and exhaled sharply. I will not allow myself to wallow in self-pity. I'm not going to replay the scene in the old bedroom over and over in my head until my temples are cramping with tension. I'm not going to let them all steal not only James from me, but also my dignity, my freedom, my future. Instead, I'll sit down at my laptop, open my email, and answer all my work emails, send my colleagues the report I was going to finish next week, book tickets to the conference I've been wanting to attend for a long time, and prove to myself that there are things that Katie can't take away from me. I did all this automatically, until the thoughts that I was chasing away from myself gradually formed into a clear, frightening, but strangely inspiring plan. I'll move in. I'm going to sell the apartment where James and I were going to build a future together, start a new life, in a new place, where I won't be haunted by memories, where there won't be shadows of the past, where I can breathe deeply without looking over my shoulder in fear that I'm about to hear my sister's voice whispering with self-satisfaction. Smirk. I've always been better. I grabbed my phone, found the realtor's number, and pressed call. Good afternoon. I want to put my apartment up for sale, I said in a flat voice, as if I hadn't said it for the first time. Sure, let's discuss the details, came the voice on the other end of the line. I listened to him, nodded, even made notes in my notebook, and a strange feeling grew in my chest, a mixture of relief and freedom. I will end this chapter of my life once and for all. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I probably knew that this would happen. I could have blocked their numbers, I could have cut them out of my life, I could even have learned not to flinch every time I heard Katie's name. But at that moment, when I stood in front of my mother, and my sister was smiling behind her back with a rounded belly, all my confidence cracked. How easy it was for her to step into this day, this moment, to reclaim someone else's attention, to make me feel like a guest in my own life again. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down, but my mother's voice, that condescending, ever condemning, ever making me feel guilty voice, was draining the last of my strength. "Excuse me?" I asked, refusing to believe I'd actually heard that. "An accident?" Mom pressed her lips into a thin line, as if my stubbornness was unbearably childish, stupid, and annoying to her. "Well, you know what I mean," she continued, her voice flat and unrepentant. "It's been a long time. You found a decent man. You're getting married. You're finally becoming part of Michael's family. Why go back to old grudges?" I felt rage boiling up in me, icy, piercing. It didn't hit my head, but on the contrary, made me extremely collected, like a taut string ready to break at any second. Old grudges? So you think that Katie sleeping with my fiancé in my own room on the day of my engagement party is just some kind of old grudge? I didn't look at my sister on purpose, because I knew there would be that smug grin, that arrogant look in which there was never a drop of regret. "Emily, baby," Mom tried to take my hand, but I pulled away. "She's your sister. You should have always stuck together. Besides, aren't you happy for her? She and Richard are going to have a baby soon. You're going to be an aunt. Isn't that wonderful?" I stared at her, trying to figure out if she was really serious. "Can you even hear me?" I asked slowly, looking first at her and then at my father, who was standing next to her and pointedly averting his eyes, as if none of this concerned him. "Do you understand that she ruined my life? That I shouldn't have rebuilt myself from the ashes? That I shouldn't have had 3 years of loneliness because the man I loved betrayed me in the dirtiest way?" "But you did it," Mom said softly, as if praising a child who had finally learned how to tie his shoelaces. "You should be proud of yourself," my father added, and I caught my breath in indignation. "Proud?" I laughed, dryly, bitterly, without a drop of joy. "Be proud of what? By the fact that even now you're putting her happiness above mine again? The fact that even on my own wedding day, you let her steal my attention?" I saw my mother's lips tighten even more as irritation appeared in her eyes. Not guilt, not regret, not remorse, but annoyance, because I, again, did not want to play their family games. "Emily, please don't ruin this day," she finally said, and something inside me finally broke. I turned around, took a step back, and looked at Katie. "Go away," I said firmly. Of course, she didn't even flinch, just tilted her head to the side and smiled sweetly. "But, I just came to congratulate you," she purred, and that voice, that tone, that fake innocence, it was all painfully familiar. "I'm not going to tell you twice," I said, and my voice was shaking, not from fear or excitement, but from pent-up rage. "Go away, immediately." Katie pretended to be offended, sighed, and glanced down at her stomach, as if trying to remind me what a new woman she was now, a mother, and that I was, of course, just a monster if I refused to accept her back into my life. But I didn't care about her games anymore. "Okay," she said, shrugging her shoulders. "It's boring here anyway." She turned and headed for the exit, defiantly graceful, as if it was her decision, as if she had graciously given me peace of mind, and I wanted to laugh, but I restrained myself. "You're making a huge mistake, Emily," Mom hissed, but I didn't care. "No," I replied, looking her straight in the eye. "I'm fixing the old one." I turned around and went back to the hall, to where Michael was waiting for me, to where love, sincerity, and people who cared about my happiness, not Katie's happiness, were waiting for me. And for the first time in many years, I felt free. I saw how the faces of the guests changed, how at first there was bewilderment in their eyes, then realization, then embarrassment, and finally horror as they digested my words. Because despite the fact that Katie had been able to pretend to be an angel all her life, and our parents had been masterfully creating the illusion of a happy, ideal family for years, this story was too ugly, too dirty to be pushed back into the dark corners of silence and lies. Katie, my perfect, brilliant, beloved Katie, stood in front of a crowd that suddenly saw her without a mask, and I enjoyed this moment with the same intensity with which I once felt the pain of her betrayal. "That's a lie," she finally gasped, but her voice was weak, trembling, not at all as confident as usual, and I knew that this time she would not be able to turn everything to her advantage. "Really?" I raised an eyebrow, feeling the anger inside me turn into an icy, ruthless determination to see this through to the end. "Then why don't you look surprised? Why don't you laugh and shout that I'm crazy? Oh yes, because it's not a lie." I took a step forward, feeling Michael quietly but firmly squeeze my hand behind me. His presence was an anchor for me, a reminder that I was no longer alone in this battle. But it was my battle, and I was going to win it to the end. "You've always been loved, Katie," I continued, not taking my eyes off her. "Your parents idolized you, forgave you everything. You never knew what the consequences were, what responsibility was, because everything was decided for you. They paid for you. They made excuses for you. You lived as you wanted, and I was always the one who had to understand, forgive, forget, and give in." I looked at my parents, at their faces, which at that moment turned gray like ashes, as if their world was collapsing along with their illusions. "I've been silent for 3 years," I said, and my voice was no longer trembling. It was firm, filled with strength that I probably didn't even know I had until that moment. I was silent because I thought that maybe I really should put this in the past, that maybe I was wrong, that maybe it's worth moving on. But today, when you came out here and tried to portray your betrayal, your meanness, as some kind of act of mercy, I realized that silence was no longer an option. Katie opened her mouth, but I raised my hand, silencing her, not giving her the slightest chance to interrupt me, to distort what she had said, as she had done all her life. "No, Katie," I shook my head. "Not today. Today is my day, and I won't let you ruin it." I turned to the guests, to my new family, to Michael's friends, to the people who were looking at me with different emotions, some with shock, some with sympathy, some even with admiration. But most importantly, they were listening. And I'll tell you one last thing. I raised my glass. My hand was no longer shaking. I was calm like never before. For love. For a love that is based on trust, respect, and sincerity. For a love that does not require lies and betrayal. For the love I found with this amazing man by my side. I turned to Michael, and he looked at me with such pride, with such tenderness, that it suddenly became easy for me to breathe, as if the heavy burden that I had been carrying for so many years had finally disappeared. "And to a new chapter," I added, smiling a little. "Clean, free from the past." I took a sip of champagne, feeling its slight tartness on my tongue, and at that moment there was applause in the hall. They started with 1 or 2 people, but soon turned into a booming, warm sea of support, the sound of which I enjoyed like never before. I looked at my parents, at their shocked faces, at my father who seemed to want to say something but could not find the words, at my mother who pressed her lips together so tightly that they turned into a thin, white line, and at Katie, who stood silently, clenching her fists, realizing for the first time in her life that she couldn't fix it, that today, this time, she hadn't won. I turned around and without looking back, headed towards Michael, towards my new life, knowing that from that moment on, the past no longer had any power over me. Michael and I listened to this news while sitting on the sunlit balcony of our bungalow, where the sound of the ocean mixed with a light breeze filled with the scent of frangipani flowers. And although I had long since stopped feeling anything but bitter fatigue for Katie, something inside me still responded with a strange, contradictory feeling when I imagined she, the former queen of the perfect life, was forced to return to her parents' house, hiding her fall from the whole world. However, I didn't feel schadenfreude, only emptiness, because no matter how many years had passed, no matter how much pain I had been through, a part of me still remembered that girl who once ran through puddles with me, built sandcastles, and made wishes with me on New Year's Eve. "Don't you regret it?" Michael asked softly, gently fingering my fingers. I looked at him, at his honest, warm eyes, at the slight smile that said that no matter what I answered, he would still stay by my side. "No," I breathed out, leaning against his shoulder, feeling calmness spread in my chest. It had to happen. He nodded, and we were silent for a while longer, until the sun began to sink to the horizon, coloring the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, and somewhere down on the beach a child's laughter rolled, reminding me that life goes on no matter what. When we returned from our honeymoon, the world seemed to have completely digested the consequences of my wedding, and although my parents did not seek to get in touch, and Katie seemed to have disappeared, I felt strangely relieved by this silence, because for the first time in many years, I did not have to justify myself, fear betrayal, or feel like the second ever losing party. Life with Michael was easy and simple, and even though I knew that there are no perfect marriages, every morning when I woke up next to him, I felt that I had chosen the right thing, and that was the most important thing. We set up our house, filling it with warmth and comfort, hosted dinners for friends, walked in parks, talked late into the night, and every day, even the most ordinary, seemed valuable to me, because for the first time in my life, I did not expect a stab in the back. But one day, at the end of autumn, when I had just returned from work, tired but happy, my mother stood on the threshold of the house, and her face was so pale and haggard that for a moment I did not even feel the usual barrier between us, because in front of me was no longer that cold, unshakable woman who I've known all my life, but just a lost person who doesn't know where to go. "Emily," she said, and her voice was low, as if broken, "we need to talk." I nodded, letting her inside, although my heart clenched into a tight knot, anticipating that this conversation would not bring anything good. We sat down in the living room and I offered her tea, because that's what Grandma Marta always did when someone was in trouble in front of her, and I, unwittingly, picked up this habit. "Is it because of Katie?" I asked, as we silently stared at the swirling steam. My mother nodded slowly, and I noticed that her fingers were trembling around the cup. She's completely broken, Emily," she whispered, and for the first time there was no reproach in her voice, just weariness. "Richard abandoned her, the courts took everything from her, and she's barely making ends meet." I pressed my lips together, looking at her carefully, feeling a strange mixture of anger and regret rise inside me, because despite everything that had happened, despite all the pain, I could not fully rejoice at her fall. "And what do you want from me?" I asked quietly. My mother looked up at me, and for the first time in many years, I saw in them not condemnation, but something like a plea. "Help her," she whispered. "You've always been stronger." I took a deep breath, feeling a storm of emotions boil in my chest, because how many times have I heard these words? How many times have I had to be strong, to bear the mistakes of others? But was it worth it to do it again, now that I had my own life, my happiness, which I had been building for so long? I got to my feet, moving to the window, watching the evening fog slowly settle, and asked myself the most difficult question. Could I let Katie back into my life, knowing how it could end? When I first found out that I was pregnant, I felt not just joy, but also a deep, overwhelming sense of completion, as if all the roads that had brought me here, through pain, betrayal, disappointment, had finally formed into one straight line, leading to a bright future where there was no place for old grudges and fruitless the expectation of a love that will never be given to me. I was standing in the bathroom, holding a test in my hands, on which 2 stripes were clearly visible, and tears were slowly rolling down my cheeks. But they were tears of relief, happiness, anticipation of something new, something real. I went into the bedroom, where Michael was leafing through a book, and without saying a word, I just handed him the test. He looked up, confused at first. Then his face lit up with joy, and the next moment, he was hugging me, bursting into happy, confused words, and I was just laughing through my tears, clinging to him, knowing that this moment is one of those that will stay with me forever. The pregnancy went smoothly, and although I expected that sooner or later my parents would find out and try to interfere in my life again, I no longer cared about their reaction. Now I had my own world, my family, my fortress, and neither their condemnation nor their accusations could shake what I had built. I focused on what really mattered, on cozy evenings with Michael, on how we chose the color of the walls in the nursery together, on the first tremors of our child, which filled me with a sense of wonder. However, the letter arrived unexpectedly. It was in a stack of correspondence among bills and advertising brochures, and I immediately recognized the handwriting, neat, clear, and immaculately even, as always. Mom's letters stared at me from the envelope, and I stood for a long time, just holding it in my hands, not knowing if I wanted to open it at all. "Is everything okay?" Michael asked, coming up to me and gently touching my shoulder. I looked at it, then back at the envelope, and finally tore it open, taking out a folded piece of paper. "Emily, we found out that you're pregnant. I do not know if you will ever want to forgive us, but I want you to know that no matter what, you will always remain our daughter. I'm not asking you to meet, but if you suddenly decide that we should be a part of your child's life, we'll wait. Mom." I reread the letter several times, trying to catch something real in it, something more than just words. But apart from empty regret, too late to change anything, I didn't feel anything. They never admitted their guilt. They never realized that their love was always selective, conditional, and depended on how convenient I was for them. I exhaled and calmly folded the letter, putting it back into the envelope. "Will you answer?" Michael asked softly. I shook my head. "No. I don't want people to come back into our lives that I've never been good enough for." He nodded in agreement and hugged me, allowing me to lean on him, feel his warmth, his support, all that I missed so much in childhood. Time passed, and when the day of giving birth came, I suddenly realized that I wasn't afraid at all. Everything that had happened up to that moment, all the pain, all the disappointments, all the resentments, didn't matter now, because there would be a new life in this world, a little person for whom I would be the best mother, not because it was necessary, but because I wanted it. When I first picked up our daughter, tiny, warm, with tiny fingers squeezing my thumb, I realized that this was the most important, the most real thing. "Lily," I whispered, looking into her face, "you will be loved, always." And I knew that I would keep that promise.